You ever meet someone who believes money makes them God? Yeah, that was my aunt. She wasn't rich because she worked for it, she just married into it. And ever since, she treated everyone beneath her like we were her servants in some twisted royal court she built out of a Georgia mansion. I learned early that power in the wrong hands can rot a person's soul. But back then, I was just a kid trying to survive it. My name's Ryan. I'm in my late 30s now, and life's been kind enough to give me perspective and patience. But when I was 9 years old, I lost both my father and my home in the same year. My parents divorced and Dad vanished like smoke. Mom was left with 2 kids, no savings, and nowhere to go. That's when Aunt offered to help. She said we could move into her big, fancy house until Mom got back on her feet. But it wasn't a home. It was a prison with chandeliers. Aunt had everything: the mansion, the cars, the picture-perfect Southern life. But the truth? She'd built it all on someone else's dime, her ex-husband's. When he cheated, she got the house, the money, and a fat settlement. She didn't earn a thing, and maybe that's why she needed to keep reminding the rest of us that she was in charge. From the first day we stepped inside, I could feel the change in the air. My mom's back straightened, her voice got quiet, and my sister clung to me like a shadow. Aunt had that presence, the kind that made everyone smaller around her. She laid out the rules like commandments: no touching the thermostat, no TV unless she was watching, no food outside of scheduled meals, and absolutely no talking back. Even chores had timestamps. Vacuuming by 3:45, dishes by 3:55, laundry done by 7:55. If the washer was still running after the minute hand hit 8, she'd walk over, flip the breaker, and smile while the machine powered down mid-cycle. That's how she ran her kingdom, through control. And what she couldn't control, she punished. Mom paid rent, even though she was her sister. She could only afford 1 bedroom, so my sister and I shared a bed for years while a perfectly good guest room sat empty for important visitors. Not once in 10 years did a guest ever show up. It was just another reminder that we didn't belong there. We were tolerated, and God help us if the church folks tried to intervene. When our pastor quietly told her it wasn't healthy for 2 teens to share a room, Aunt exploded. She said no one tells her what to do in her house. That night, she screamed at Mom for an hour straight, blaming her for the embarrassment. And I swear the next morning, something broke in Mom's eyes. Aunt had this way of snapping her fingers when she wanted something, not asking, not calling, snapping. Like she was calling a dog. And if you didn't jump fast enough, she'd say, "That's the problem with your side of the family. No discipline." Every time I heard that, my blood boiled. But I stayed quiet. Because when you live under someone like her, silence is survival. Her own kids hated it too. At first, they defended her, said she was just strict. But as they got older, even they couldn't stand being in that house. They started spending more time with their dad until eventually, she only had them on weekends. And that made her worse. The fewer people she could control, the harder she squeezed the ones who were left. Us. By the time I hit high school, I barely recognized myself. I'd go days without talking to anyone. My confidence was gone, my self-worth was shattered, and every dream I had felt stupid. I wasn't living. I was waiting. Waiting for her to die, for us to leave, or for something to give. There were nights I lay in bed wondering if it would be easier if I just disappeared. That's how much power she had over us and over me, and then one day I broke. It was summer. I had just graduated high school, started community college, and was working part-time at a hardware store. 2 weeks into my first semester, I was sitting at the table doing homework when she walks in. Arms crossed, lips tight, that fake sugary tone that always came before something cruel. She says, "You owe me rent this month. Same amount for next month, too. You're an adult now." I looked up thinking I misheard her. "Excuse me?" She just repeated it like it was law. "It's the 27th. You're grown. You've got a job. Time to start paying your share." Something inside me cracked. All the years of fear, all the times I stayed quiet, gone. I stood up and said, "You can't just decide that out of nowhere. I have rights." "You want rent?" "Fine. Give me a rental agreement and 30 days notice like everyone else." Her face twisted. She wasn't used to being challenged, and especially by me. She screamed, "Don't you raise your voice in my house." I shouted right back, "Then stop treating me like a child if you're gonna charge me like an adult." And I turned around, fists clenched, trying to walk away before I said something worse. That's when she grabbed my wrist. Hard. I spun my arm forward to pull free. Momentum carried her arm straight into the wall. She screamed like I'd hit her. I hadn't, but she made sure everyone else thought I did. Within an hour, cops were at the house. She told them I'd attacked her. Her story changed every time she told it, but mine didn't. I remembered everything. The angle of the hallway, the smell of her perfume, the sound of the breaker still humming from the laundry room. They didn't charge me, but I was kicked out that night. And I remember standing on the curb with my duffel bag, watching her silhouette through the window, thinking, one day you're gonna pay for what you did to us. Not with fists, with something worse. That night was the end of one life, and the quiet beginning of another. Mom stayed a little longer, trapped by circumstance. But I promised myself, when I got out, I'd find a way to make sure no one like her ever had power over us again. And I kept that promise, because money might have made her feel like God. But I was going to show her what happens when God runs out of cash. After that night on the curb, there was no dramatic movie montage where I find myself and everything snaps into place. There was only cold pavement, a duffel bag, and a kind stranger who let me sleep in his garage for a week. Life after Aunt wasn't clean. It was a slow, filthy scrape back to solid ground. I lied to myself for a while, pretending I'd left because I wanted freedom. The truth was uglier. I left because I had to. If I'd stayed, I would have turned into something small and mean and brittle, a version of my aunt with a quieter voice. That thought made my skin crawl. I refused that. Mom moved out a few months later, once she'd scraped together enough from the church's help and a few late paychecks. She cried the first night in the new apartment like a dam had finally burst. I sat in the doorway and watched her breathe. That sound, the sound of relief, felt like a currency I'd been owed for years. I wasn't heroic. I hustled. I worked nights stocking shelves, worked mornings as a janitor, took whatever odd job came my way. I fell asleep at work a few times because the bills didn't care if I was tired. The years that followed taught me two things about money. It doesn't heal wounds, but it buys you choices. And a person with no money is never truly free. It was during those long radio static nights that I started paying attention. Not to soap operas or gossip, to systems. How things moved. Who profited from what. I read tax guides and city planning articles the way other people read novels. I took community college classes in business and government policy because I wanted to understand the rules that made people rich or broke. I wanted to see the gears so I could someday turn them. Work eventually found me something steadier. I got a job in a municipal office, and not glamorous, not high-ranking, but enough to stop sleeping in my car. It was a boring desk job at first, a lot of filing and cross-referencing. But I learned how government programs read maps, how zoning decisions were recorded, how public notices that seemed meaningless actually mattered to someone with an eye. I watched how development projects were written on paper months before shovels hit the ground. I learned the cadence of planning meetings, the polite handshakes, the veiled favors, the way a single vote could make or break a neighborhood. With time, I moved up. Not because I was flashy, because I learned to be reliable, quietly smart, and unbearably patient. I kept my head down, took classes at night, and made friends who were smarter than me and generous with their knowledge. I saved, not obsessively but carefully. I watched numbers the way my aunt watched her money, except without the arrogance that ruined her. I also kept my family close. My sister thrived once we were out of that house. She found a job she loved and a grit that made her fierce. Mom, bless her, rebuilt her life like someone replanting a garden. Slow, careful, thoughtful. She learned to budget, to say no without apology, to keep some change for herself. Watching them reclaim pieces of their lives was like watching light leak through curtains after years of blackout. And the cousins, that part was complicated. For a while, their faces were a painful reminder. They grew up under the same tyranny as we did, and yet their mother, my aunt, had a way of cloaking herself in victimhood with them. They were protective, loyal, and I learned human. As they became adults and more independent, conversations loosened. They asked me questions, small at first, then bigger. Do you remember when...
Did she ever?
They wanted clarity, and in time, they believed me. That belief was not just emotional restitution. It mattered because, in the financial world, reputation is currency. Once my cousins started trusting me, they naturally began to ask for my opinions. About saving, about where to put money, about the little financial decisions adults make and then ignore. I never pushed. I taught. I nudged. I told them to diversify, to read the fine print, to think long-term, because I'd seen what happens when someone uses money as a weapon. But the idea of revenge lingered like a low fever, always there, flaring when I thought about all the little cruelties. Not the big obvious ones so much, the small. Economic violences, rent demands, grocery restrictions, the water heater disaster that cost my sister $5,000 because Aunt refused to maintain anything unless it suited her image. Those things stuck in me like grit. The worst of it was watching my aunt's money not just by comfort, but arrogance. She'd parade investments in conversations like trophies. She'd brag about a lot she thought would appreciate because someone told her it would. She wasn't stupid. She was stupid about one thing. She believed her money would always save her from insight. Years of scraping by sharpened a dangerous clarity in me. Money controls choices. Yes, but knowledge controls opportunity. If you can read the map before others do, you get first pick. If you can interpret the quiet signs of real estate, the sewer maps, the environmental reports, the small notices from obscure boards, you can foresee where a market will pivot. I began to see a plan, slow and exacting. It wasn't born of malice alone. It was born of justice, of a quiet arithmetic of payback. I didn't want to humiliate her in public or hurt those who were innocent. I wanted a consequence that fit the crime. Take away the things she used like a cudgel. Money. I started small. I helped my cousins sort their investments, showed them how to read property listings, how to spot pump and dump schemes, and how to ask the right questions when a sure thing crossed their phones. I watched their confidence grow, and with it, the way they'd relay conversation back to their mother. Money talks in families, sometimes through text messages, sometimes through dinner table boasts. I listened to how she replied, how she dreamed out loud, how her greed overrode caution. The conversations were the map. I won't pretend I didn't rationalize. I told myself the truth, that she had spent a decade financially and emotionally bankrupting my family. I told myself I was correcting a moral imbalance. That didn't make it clean. It made it necessary in my mind. There were nights when I wrestled with the ethics like an animal in a net. I asked myself if I'd become the same kind of manipulator I'd always resented. I read law books until my eyes blurred. I sat with a lawyer friend over coffee and mapped out gray areas. I was careful. I didn't want to fall into the trap of poisoning a person's life deliberately for sport. I wanted structure, plausible deniability, and above all, non-violence. And so I built a strategy that was legal at its core but morally exacting. I leveraged public information, rumors that had weight, and the human inclination to want more, faster. I let the cousins' natural trust in their mother direct her steps. She would walk herself into the trap, driven by the same greed that had let her dominate us for years. The work was meticulous. I tracked developments, zoning hearings, and environmental assessments. I learned how to read an engineering report and how to find the buried, unglamorous sections of municipal planning documents that spelled doom for quick development, wetlands, soil instability, toxic cleanup costs. Those parts don't make the headlines, but they make land worthless. I learned patience, too. That might be the hardest currency to earn. Revenge, when it's worth anything, takes time. It needs planting, watering, and then waiting for the frost to kill the crop. I watched neighborhoods rise and neighborhoods stall. I knew which announcements were smoke and which were the real flames. I built credibility with my cousins by giving them sound conservative advice. I didn't rush. I planted seeds in their ears and waited for the fruit of their decisions, and all the while I kept my morality close enough to touch. I refused to lie outright. I refused to falsify documents or hack systems. What I did was more human and, in my judgment, more damning. I guided, I suggested, I amplified the parts of reality that would tempt her. I let her make the final decision to buy. She believed she was acting on insider knowledge of development and growth. She believed she was clever. When she started buying, it felt anticlimactic. There was no triumphant drum roll, just the quiet knowledge gnawing at my ribs. This is happening. She was spending her last truly liquid assets on land parcels that looked shiny on maps, but were rotten beneath the surface. $300,000. She poured years of saved vanity into dirt with a bad future. Even typing that number makes me taste metal. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the spreadsheet on my laptop, the numbers stark and factual. I tried to imagine what it would feel like when the market turned, when the environmental reports were published, and when the public meetings explained why development had shifted 6 miles away. Would I feel vindicated? Would I feel empty? I didn't know then. What I did know was this. I had balanced the ledger in my head. For years, she'd been debiting our lives with humiliation and crediting her own with guilt-free opulence. It wasn't about the money alone. It was about agency. For once, she would be the one stuck with decisions she couldn't control. Part of me feared what the outcome would do to me. Revenge is a hard beast to hold, even when it is slow and surgical. But the other part, the quieter, braver part that had been learning how to stand since I was 9, felt something else. A hollow filling up. Not joy, a sense of alignment. When the first hint of trouble began to leak, a paragraph in a county environmental review, a muted press release about infeasible construction due to groundwater contamination, I felt a tight, childish joy I hadn't allowed myself in years. It wasn't celebration. It was measure. The universe was catching up. When the email came in, I almost didn't open it. Subject line read, investment follow-up, urgent. I remember staring at it, hands shaking, that sick mix of adrenaline and guilt flooding my stomach. I'd planted the bait months earlier, and this was the bite. I clicked. Ryan, I went ahead and moved $300,000 into the commercial real estate fund you mentioned. They said they'll send confirmation next week. You were right. It feels good to finally put my money somewhere productive. Maybe you're not the same angry boy after all. For a second, I just sat there. Couldn't breathe. She really did it. She'd moved her entire retirement. And she still couldn't resist that last jab, still needed to remind me who she thought she was dealing with. I whispered to myself, you shouldn't feel happy about this. But I did. God help me, I did. It wasn't a fake company, not exactly. It was a real fund, but one that was already crumbling, a pyramid waiting to collapse. I'd sent her the tip under a fake name, wrapped in the kind of slick financial jargon she'd always fallen for. I knew her weakness wasn't greed alone, it was ego. She needed to believe she was smarter than everyone else. So I made sure the investment looked exclusive, a private entry offer for high net worth individuals. That phrase alone would have made her drool. And it worked. She wired the money. And within 6 months, the fund folded. When the markets dipped that spring, she called me crying. Actually crying. The same woman who once mocked my mother for being too emotional was sobbing over the phone like a child who'd lost her toy. Ryan, it's gone, she said, voice cracking. All of it. My savings, my backup, everything. They said it was insured, but it's not. What do I do? I said nothing at first. Just listened. The silence stretched until she choked out, Please, say something. I swallowed hard and finally said, Now you know what it feels like. Click. That was it. For days afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mom crying on that same floor 15 years earlier. The night Aunt screamed at her for eating dinner too late. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part, disgusted. I wanted justice. But what I got felt like ashes. 2 weeks later, Mom called. She said Aunt was in the hospital. Panic attack. Stress-induced arrhythmia. They didn't know if she'd make it through the night. And suddenly all that rage, all those years of hatred, they collapsed into something else. Something I didn't expect. Guilt. Because as much as I'd hated her, she was still family. Twisted, toxic, cruel, but family. I drove all night to get there. When I walked into that sterile hospital room, she looked small for the first time in her life. All that power she used to wield, gone. No pearls, no designer coat, no smug smile, just tubes, pale skin, and eyes that darted toward me like a cornered animal. She didn't speak for a while. Then she whispered, "You did this." I didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it either. I just stood there, every muscle locked in place. Then she said something I never saw coming. "You're just like me." That one hit harder than any insult she'd ever thrown, because somewhere deep down I was terrified she might be right. She made it through that night, barely. Lost the house soon after. Moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. No more servants, no more polished image. Just a woman sitting alone with her memories and her regret. Mom tried to forgive her. I couldn't, not yet. Maybe not ever. A few years passed. One fall afternoon, I drove past the old mansion. The yard was overgrown, the windows covered in grime. A for sale sign leaned sideways in the dirt. I parked for a minute, rolled down the window, and just watched. Memories hit like a tidal wave. Laughter that never felt safe. Dinners that tasted like control. Holidays that felt like rehearsals. I realized that house was never really hers. It belonged to the power she worshipped. And now even that had abandoned her. Money doesn't build homes. It builds cages, and she'd spent her entire life decorating hers. A few months later, Mom called again. Aunt had passed away in her sleep. No drama this time. No explosions. Just quiet. I went to the funeral. Small crowd, and maybe 10 people. I stood in the back, hands in my pockets, heart strangely calm. The preacher talked about forgiveness, about letting go of bitterness, about finding peace in the ashes of what we lose. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much. When they lowered her into the ground, I whispered one thing under my breath. We're free now. It's been years since then. I built my own business, legitimate this time, and helped Mom buy a little place by the lake. Nothing fancy, but it's ours. Some nights I still think about that house, that woman, that decade of control. And every time I do, I remind myself of one truth. Power built on fear will always crumble. And money, when it replaces love, becomes the cruelest god of all.